There is a crisis unfolding in the skies above Canada, not a visible one, not one that shows up on radar screens or makes headlines on the evening news every day, but a structural, strategic, and sovereign crisis that has been building for decades and which has now arrived at a moment so politically charged that it is reshaping how an entire country understands its own independence. To understand what is happening right now with Canada's fighter jet program, you have to go back to the beginning, because the story of Canada trying to replace its aging CF-18 fleet is not a story about aircraft. It is a story about identity, dependency, and the uncomfortable question of what it actually means to be an autonomous nation in the shadow of the world's most powerful military. The Royal Canadian Air Force has relied on the CF-18 as its main fighter jet for decades, but those aircraft are now considered technologically redundant, outdated, and at serious risk of becoming unserviceable by the 2030s. Some of these airframes are approaching 45 years of active service. Think about that for a moment. The pilots flying missions in those cockpits today are sometimes younger than the aircraft they are sitting inside. The CF-18s are becoming more expensive and more difficult to maintain due to a shortage of spare parts and their sheer age. Canada did take interim measures, purchasing 25 used FA-18 Hornets from Australia when its Air Force began sunsetting the multi-role fighters because it was introducing the F-35, and all 18 airworthy Australian Hornets have now been integrated into the RCAF to bolster current squadron numbers. But these are stopgaps, patches on a wound that requires surgery. The story of Canada trying to find a proper replacement goes back even further than most people realize. In July 2010, Prime Minister Stephen Harper's Conservative government announced plans to purchase 65 F-35As for $9 billion Canadian dollars, arguing the aircraft was essential for Canada's defense and Arctic sovereignty. That announcement was made with confidence, with conviction, as if the decision were simple and settled. It was neither. Political controversy followed almost immediately, and when the Trudeau Liberals came to power, they pledged to reopen the process entirely, to hold an open competition, and to be transparent about how Canada would choose its next generation of warplanes. What followed was years of consultations, evaluations, proposals, and process. A procurement saga so long and complicated that it began to feel almost comical from the outside, though it was anything but funny for the men and women of the Royal Canadian Air Force who were watching their aircraft age beneath them. By 2019, 3 supplier teams remained in the competition: Sweden's Saab with the Gripen E, the Boeing Company with the FA-18 Super Hornet, and Lockheed Martin with the F-35 Lightning II. Each of these companies visited Canadian air bases, submitted proposals, and made their case to the government. The Eurofighter Typhoon, backed by the United Kingdom, had already withdrawn. In August 2019, the UK government and its commercial partner Airbus officially notified Canada of their withdrawal from the competitive process. And so the field narrowed and the competition continued, grinding forward through political changes, pandemic disruptions, and shifting priorities. By December 2021, following the evaluation of proposals, 2 bidders remained eligible: the Swedish government with Saab's Gripen E and the United States government with Lockheed Martin's F-35. By March 2022, the choice had come down to those 2 options. Ottawa once again selected the F-35, framing the decision around NATO obligations, NORAD interoperability, and the need to assert Arctic sovereignty. The deal was valued at around $19 billion for 88 jets, with first deliveries originally scheduled for 2025. In January 2023, that decision was finalized. Canada signed a deal with Lockheed Martin to buy F-35 stealth fighters to replace the Air Force's aging CF-18 jets. The agreement would see the first tranche of 16 fighters delivered between 2026 and 2030, and it was the result of an open competition in which Saab's Gripen E placed second. It seemed like the matter was settled. Canada had made its choice. The long procurement odyssey had reached its destination, except that it hadn't, because history, geopolitics, and one very unpredictable American president had other plans. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, the relationship between Canada and the United States entered territory that very few people in Ottawa had genuinely anticipated. Trump's administration began treating Canada not as an ally, but as a leverage point, imposing tariffs, making extraordinary statements about annexation, and openly musing about Canada becoming the 51st American state. In March 2025, a newly elected Prime Minister, Mark Carney, found himself defending Canadian interests from U.S. President Donald Trump's threats of annexation and the imposition of punishing tariffs on Canada's trade. While promising to increase spending on defense and security, Carney also vowed to shift Canada's near-total dependency on the U.S. for its military hardware, and ordered the RCAF to conduct a review of the F-35 purchase. That review changed everything, because it did not simply open a bureaucratic process, it opened a national conversation about something much deeper. The question was no longer just which jet should Canada buy. The question became, what does it mean for Canada to fly American jets maintained through American software, on American servers, authorized through American systems, at a moment when the American government is actively threatening Canadian sovereignty? That question, once asked, could not be unasked. Fears of a paralyzed cloud update system housed on U.S.-controlled servers began driving serious aversion to the F-35 under Trump's tenure as U.S. Commander-in-Chief. This is not a trivial concern. The F-35 is not simply an aircraft, it is a networked system. Its mission data, its software updates, its operational parameters, all of these are managed through a support architecture that ultimately runs through American infrastructure. Saab responded to this vulnerability by offering to build a sovereign data center in Montreal, promising that Canadian mission data and software would remain under Canadian control rather than being routed through the F-35's U.S.-hosted support architecture. And that offer landed with considerable force in a country that was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely worried about what the United States might do. Saab's test pilot and operational advisor, Jussi Halmetoja, articulated it plainly. What it really gives you is sovereignty, your indigenous capability to take the data that you collect and to own it. For a government whose stated priority is data sovereignty, those words carried weight. Now let us talk about Saab and the Gripen proposal itself, because it is extraordinary in its scope and in what it represents for Canada's industrial future. Saab made a very attractive proposal, the purchase of 72 Gripen fighters, which would be assembled in Canada, along with 6 GlobalEye surveillance aircraft. The platform for the GlobalEye is already built by Bombardier in Quebec. In total, Saab is promising to deliver 12,000 high-tech jobs in Canada's aviation sector. Some more recent estimates put that figure even higher. Saab's current pitch includes 12,600 domestic jobs and Arctic-optimized maintenance capability. Think about what that means in concrete terms. Not just purchasing an aircraft, but building one. Not just buying a capability, but developing a national aerospace industrial base that could sustain itself for decades. Saab has argued that a Canadian-based production line could support thousands of jobs while ensuring that much of the intellectual property and maintenance work remains in the country. The GlobalEye component is particularly significant because Canadian aerospace companies, including Bombardier, could be involved, as the Global 6000 business jet serves as the platform for the GlobalEye system. This is not a foreign company asking Canada to buy its product. This is a foreign company asking Canada to become a manufacturing partner. Industry Minister Melanie Joly made perhaps her most pointed comments to date, acknowledging publicly that the federal government was talking with Swedish defense contractor Saab and saying that the $27 billion contract to buy 88 U.S.-made F-35 jets doesn't deliver enough jobs for workers in this country and that the public expects a better deal. That is a remarkable statement from a sitting government minister. It is not the language of routine procurement review. It is the language of a government that has already begun to recalibrate. And the economics of the Gripen are genuinely compelling. Alan Williams, the Defense Department's former top procurement official, said, "I would be cognizant of the fact that 70% of the costs of any acquisition is the life cycle sustainment costs, and these costs for the Gripen are 1/6 the cost of the F-35. So I would be shocked if in fact the cost analysis didn't say, Prime Minister, you can save a ton of money by having 2 fleets. 1/6. That is not a marginal difference. That is a transformative difference in the long-term financial burden on Canadian taxpayers. The Gripen is relatively cheap compared to the French Rafale or the F-35, and its operational costs are lower than those of all other Western fighter jets. The Gripen can be deployed to areas where military facilities are underdeveloped, since it can take off from small runways due to its high flexibility and can operate in all types of weather. That last point matters enormously for Canada specifically, because Canada is not just a temperate country with well-equipped air bases. Canada is an Arctic nation with massive remote territories that need to be defended, territories where the infrastructure assumptions built into the F-35 program simply do not apply in the same way. The Gripen may be used in various operations, whether in air-to-air or air-to-ground combat, in the Arctic or in the Middle East. Its small size, speed, and 27mm Mauser cannon, coupled with an electronic warfare system and infrared search and track abilities, make it particularly lethal in dogfights and air-to-air combat. In addition, the Gripen is highly interoperable and fit for reconnaissance missions thanks to its data link system. And yet, and this is where the analysis becomes genuinely difficult, there are serious substantive arguments on the other side that cannot be dismissed as mere American pressure or Lockheed Martin lobbying. According to the U.S. Accountability Office, the Block 4 version of the F-35, the one which Canada is buying, is currently $6 billion over budget and 5 years behind schedule. That is a devastating headline, but the counterargument is equally serious. The F-35's edge in survivability, sensor fusion, and interoperability with allied forces is crucial as Canada juggles Arctic defense, NORAD, and coalition warfare. Canada is not buying a jet to fly in isolation. It is buying a jet to fly alongside Americans, alongside British forces, alongside other NATO allies, and increasingly alongside partners in the Indo-Pacific. In that context, interoperability is not a buzzword. It is a combat multiplier. Considering Canada's role in providing operational support as part of its NORAD and NATO commitments, F-35s have an advantage. Deployment of Canadian jets under these alliances demands complex and diverse mission capabilities with more focus on intelligence gathering, command and control, and reconnaissance. Stealth is an important factor in fighter jet performance for these mission types, which makes the F-35 better suited for joint operations together with Canada's allies. As many NATO allies also have F-35 fleets, physical infrastructure at air bases across the alliance would be better adapted for potential Canadian deployment. Major General Chris McKenna, a senior RCAF officer and operational commander within NORAD, heavily implied the F-35 was the right option during a December 2025 interview, saying that while it is a sovereign decision for Canada to make, he would say that NORAD needs an aircraft that has overmatch over the adversaries. Those are careful but clear words from someone who flies these missions, who understands the threat environment, who is not speaking from a lobbying position but from an operational one. The comment potentially rules out the Gripen as NORAD's preferred platform. The Americans have made their position explicit. In mid-January 2026, U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra told CBC News that if Canada did not proceed with the full F-35 purchase, NORAD would need to be altered because the United States would need to increase its fighter presence to address any capability gaps. He warned this could mean more U.S. jets flying into Canadian airspace more frequently, and possibly a need for Washington to buy additional F-35s for its own forces, saying, if Canada is no longer going to provide that capability, then we have to fill those gaps. This is extraordinary diplomatic language. The United States is essentially warning Canada that sovereignty over its own airspace could be compromised not by an adversary, but by its closest ally, if Canada makes the wrong procurement choice. This unusually blunt diplomatic language has sparked controversy in Ottawa and the Canadian military, with critics saying Washington is blending military reasoning with political pressure. And that criticism is valid, because there is something deeply uncomfortable about a situation in which the country selling the jet is also the country threatening consequences if you don't buy it. It blurs the line between alliance management and economic coercion in a way that Canada, and frankly, all U.S. allies, should pay attention to. There is also the question of whether the Gripen would even be as independent from American components as advertised. A CBC report highlighted that in addition to the US-made GE F414G engine, a Canadian Gripen purchase would depend on US-controlled interoperability hardware, such as the Multifunctional Information Distribution System used for Link 16. Washington could, in theory, withhold these components, potentially undermining the feasibility of a mixed F-35 Gripen fleet from the outset. This is the Gripen's Achilles heel in the sovereignty argument. If the engine and the communications hardware are American, then the leverage point is merely shifted rather than eliminated. The analysis concludes that the Gripen could be a better choice if Canada prioritizes homeland defense and long-run industrial sovereignty, whereas F-35s perform better in terms of NATO and NORAD interoperability, as well as global reach and power projection. That is a genuine analytical trade-off, not a political one. It requires Canada to first answer a prior question. What kind of military does Canada want to be, and what kind of threats is it primarily preparing for? Meanwhile, the review itself has become something of a saga within a saga. The review was initially expected to conclude by September 2025, but more than 6 months later, it remains completely unresolved. Canadian Defence Minister David McGuinty confirmed the review is still ongoing and that Ottawa has not set a timeline for a decision. This delay has a cost. Every month of indecision is another month the CF-18 fleet continues to age. Every month of uncertainty is another month that Canadian pilots are flying aircraft that belong in aviation museums rather than combat operations. Despite persistent arm twisting from Washington, including public threats that Canada could be kicked out of NORAD if the deal is shelved, Ottawa has refused to commit to a fresh timeline. That refusal is itself a political statement. It says, "We are not going to be rushed into a decision that will shape our military for the next 40 years simply because Washington is impatient, but it also has real operational consequences." Canada remains contractually committed to the first 16 F-35 aircraft, which are already in production. These jets are expected to begin delivery in 2026. The initial deployment plan called for the aircraft to be stationed at Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, where Canadian pilots would train before the jets were moved to Canadian bases. The first 16 are coming regardless. The question is what comes after them, and whether the remaining 72 slots become F-35s, Gripens, or some combination of both. Saab has sensed the moment and moved with remarkable strategic agility. Sweden and Ukraine signed a letter of intent in preparation for an export deal that would send up to 150 Gripens to Ukraine, which means Saab is ramping up production capacity anyway, and a Canadian production hub would serve dual purposes. The Swedish defense firm is considering Canada as a place to assemble Gripen fighter jets, as it moves to quickly ramp up production to meet demand from Ukraine. The Gripens are seen as a priority for Ukraine since they are easy to maintain and can take off from and land on roads, while their crews do not take long to train. Canada, in other words, would not just be buying a weapons system, it would be embedding itself into a European defense supply chain at a moment when that supply chain is in high demand. Saab has also been developing its next-generation combat aviation concept, a program called the Concept for Framtida Stridsflyg, and the company believes Canada could become a partner in shaping next-generation air combat capabilities. This is the longest-term element of the Saab pitch, and it is the one that rarely gets enough attention in the day-to-day coverage. It is not just about today's Gripen. It is about the possibility of Canada participating in sixth-generation fighter development through a Swedish partnership rather than simply purchasing American hardware indefinitely. The political theater has been remarkable to watch. Sweden's King Carl XV Gustaf and Queen Sylvia visited Ottawa during the ongoing debate about which fighter jets Canada would add to its military fleet, American F-35s or Swedish Gripens, royal diplomacy in service of defense sales. It is, as critics noted, a form of soft power deployment unlike anything Canada had seen in a procurement process before. Bringing Swedish royalty to head a sales delegation to Canada is the epitome of a lobbying strategy. This is not about capability, it is about political influence. Whether that framing is entirely fair to Saab is debatable, but it reflects the extent to which the Gripen campaign has been a full-spectrum political operation, not just a technical proposal. And Canada is not the only one being watched closely. The decision will send signals to other allies about whether a medium-power democracy can resist American pressure in defense procurement. It will send signals about whether the promise of industrial partnership and technology transfer can genuinely compete with the proven allure of American fifth-generation stealth. And it will send signals about whether NORAD, that foundational institution of North American defense, is truly a partnership of equals, or whether it is an arrangement in which one partner gets to define the terms of participation. Ottawa must now balance the F-35's unmatched NORAD interoperability against the Gripen's economic sovereignty as the aging CF-18 Hornet fleet reaches its structural limit. That balance is not simply a technical calculation, it is a philosophical one. It asks Canada to decide how it weighs short-term military risk against long-term industrial and political autonomy. It asks whether the country that chose not to join the Iraq War, that maintained peacekeeping as a national identity, that prides itself on a certain distinctiveness from its southern neighbor, can now translate those values into an actual hardware decision with real strategic consequences. What we know right now, as of May 2026, is this: the 16 F-35s are coming. The first 8 of the RCAF F-35As will be delivered in the coming months to Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, where pilots will begin immediate training. The remaining 72 are still undecided. Defense Minister McGuinty said the review of the F-35 purchase is continuing and that Ottawa is taking the necessary time to study the fighter fleet question very closely. No timeline has been set. The Department of National Defense spokesperson has confirmed that findings will be finalized by the end of the calendar summer, after which they will be submitted to Prime Minister Mark Carney for a final decision. And what is Saab's final offer on the table? Saab is offering full technology transfer, source code access for mission systems, sovereign data control, independent upgrade and maintenance rights, and a made-in-Canada proposal that includes full local manufacturing. The local manufacturing component has made Saab's pitch particularly attractive to Canadian policymakers focused on aerospace jobs, supply chain sovereignty, and independent operational control of mission-critical software. France's Dassault Rafale and Airbus's Eurofighter Typhoon have also been mentioned as European alternatives, but Saab's offer remains the most developed and the most politically activated of the three. The real issue is not just whether the Gripen outperforms the F-35, but whether Canada can reach a decisive, coherent choice before the CF-18's various problems become unmanageable. Ottawa may deliberate extensively over which jet fits national needs, but it cannot debate forever. That is the brutal truth at the heart of all of this. Canada has delayed this decision so many times across so many governments under so many political pressures that the operational window for a clean transition is narrowing to the point of crisis. Every year without a firm decision is a year closer to the moment when the CF-18 fleet simply cannot perform its missions reliably. The Swedish proposal did not create Canada's fighter jet crisis. That crisis has roots stretching back 15 years through canceled programs, broken promises, botched competitions, and political cowardice masquerading as due diligence. What the Swedish proposal did was something more interesting. It arrived at exactly the right moment to force Canada to ask a harder version of the question it had been avoiding. Not just, which jet should we buy, but what kind of country do we want to be, and who do we want to depend on when it matters most? That question has no clean technical answer. It lives at the intersection of military strategy, industrial policy, alliance politics, and national identity, and Canada will have to answer it one way or another before the summer is out.